we see the image that will not come as a shock to most of you, because that's what we have been talking about all day. The group of the BRICS is growing faster economically in a very rough measure than the decline of the G7 takes place. Now, what I would like to do is to show that what is at stake here is a contest between two types of state-society relation, and that we are looking not at an external confrontation, an external relation between the BRICS and the G7, but also at an internal one, an historically connected process of growth. And the end of my talk will be that what we must expect is not so much victory of the BRICS in the contest with the G7, but a contest between the populations of the world and the oligarchies which have been forming, especially in the last 20 years, and which also include the BRICS. They are not free from oligarchy either. Behind every leader, as we see them every night in the news, whether it's Putin or Xi Jinping, there is one or more oligarchs who also have quite something to say in their respective countries. And they are looking much more eagerly towards the West than we would expect if we look primarily at the conflicts that are taking place. Let me see. This is the basic scheme that I'm using. It's a relation that began to take shape in the 17th century, 18th century, and that is between a liberal West, which was essentially anglophone, so built around Britain and the British Empire and the United States. You know, when they asked Bismarck towards the end of his life what he thought was the most important event in world politics that he had been witness of, he said the fact that North America speaks English. And if you also include Australia and New Zealand and Canada, of course the former British Empire, you understand we are looking at a very homogeneous cultural space on which a space of common legal culture, a space of common political habits, a space of individualism, and ultimately a space of capitalism has grown. Nothing of the sort can be detected in the BRICS. There's no cultural unity, and also the other unities that I mentioned, other than strategic, which is already quite something if you only think of tactical, has taken place. Now, the liberal West is here depicted as Wall Street, which is where capital is sovereign, and sovereignty means that you represent the highest authority in the larger social whole, and below it is an open society. And as I will show in a minute, being in that open society is not always fun. It can be very deleterious to your safety, to your economic survival chances, etc. Now, facing the liberal West are what I call the contender states. That are states that are not necessarily attacking the West, but that are states that want to be considered as equivalent and as equally entitled to the West. And here the state is sovereign, and the society below it is closed, and that again is a very important condition for the population affected. Now, what I want to stress, and it will all be over very quickly, what I want to stress is that in the 17th century, when these ideal types began to form, the English-speaking space, so basically the British Isles and North America, so New England in the east of North America, also passed through the phase of the sovereign state and a closed society. We should not forget that in the mid-17th century there was Cromwell, there was the Navigation Acts, and there was a closure of England society, which, for instance, led to wars with my own native Netherlands, which at the time were commercially superior, but in terms of population, of course, much weaker than England. And what happened in the English-speaking space was that the sovereign state and the closed society, which had been theorized, for instance, by Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan in 1651, was overtaken by a new ideologue of the ruling class, and that was John Locke. And he wrote, of course, the 2 treatises of government, in which he explained that the state should not at all be sovereign in the sense that Hobbes phrased it, that the state should allow society to develop on its own account, and that led to sovereign capital. So we're looking here not just as ideal types which are opposed to each other, which are historically connected, and that's not just an intellectual nicety, you know, to enjoy ourselves because it's smart. That will take us back again to the BRICS, West versus BRICS condition, because it means that the BRICS ideally would also be moving to that liberal state which lies beyond the original Cromwellian Hobbesian state society relation, and which is only retarded, so to speak, because the West is acting aggressively towards these states and the processes in which they are involved. Now here we see the same figure again, but now with their populations attached. For sovereign capital and its open society, humanity is an anonymous, ideally speaking, humanity is an anonymous, indifferentiated mass, which is, for instance, why the advocates of capitalism, like, for instance, Peter Sutherland, the Goldman Sachs banker who was also director of British Petroleum and a host of other countries, but he was also but he was also the UN Commissioner for Migration. And he took this view that humanity is this anonymous mass which you approach quantitatively. That means you have a certain amount of humanity here, and you have another amount of humanity there, and if the balance is wrong, you simply move part of humanity to that other space. And his aggressive advocacy of migration was rooted in that idea. He claimed that, and we're talking about the 1990s and early 21st century, he claimed that migration is a human right, and every migrant should be welcomed and given the same right as any indigenous population. And he also had to say something about these indigenous population, because he said that one of the great tragedies of Europe was that we stuck to our national homogeneity. We thought it was very special to be a Frenchman or a French woman in France, a Dutchman and a Dutch woman in the Netherlands, and he said, literally in a BBC interview, you should attack that homogeneity because you have to follow what Australia and the United States did, and that was mix a whole population into a new brew. And here you have that brew at the bottom. Of course, what he didn't stress was that that required that you would exterminate the original population. And the problem in Europe is now simply that the indigenous population, and we're not talking about political labels here, but that the indigenous population doesn't want to be exterminated, simply too numerous. Now, that is the perspective of the liberal state, the Lockean state, the state in the spirit of John Locke, the state where capital is sovereign. Of course, these are extreme ideal types. Reality is always more complicated. But now look at the rival formation, the situation where the state is sovereign and society is closed. And here you see a segment of the world population which is not anonymous and not free to move inside, outside, or to any place in the world. That means that at some point in its development, because we're talking about the development, at some point in its development, the sovereign state carves out a segment of world population as its own, and it protects it. It protects it against the extreme effects of market economics. Now in the BRICS, of course, that is a bit of a problematic statement, because some of the world records in exploitation of human labor have been broken in China, as we all know, in the Apple factories and the other diversified Western company workplaces. But the idea remains that a protectionist state also protects its population to some extent. Now, that precisely has always been the angle point of the attack of the Western liberal forces, because they've always have had the impulse, and not out of bad character but for structural reasons, they've always had the impulse to make that particular population part of the large undifferentiated mass of humanity that we see here below. And you see that, for instance, when the first really big contender state manifested itself, which was France, which is why the Arc de Triomphe is placed as an illustration. Then, for instance, the Napoleonic continental system was attacked by Britain and its clients on the European continent. But when it became especially acute, when Germany, after the unification of North Germany in 1871, not only manifested itself as a powerful contender state in the field of basic science, in the field of industry, in the field of philosophy, arts, just think of the music of Wagner and Bruckner and all their friends, etc. But then in combination with a population, again selected, carved out of the world of total humanity, anonymous humanity, and that was that the German population, relatively protected from world market pressures, developed a working class movement, a labor movement that is often forgotten, was 10 times the size of the French labor movement at the time and the English labor movement. The latter two were both 100,000, roughly, organized as trade unionists. In Germany there were 1 million trade unionists. They were all organized in clubs, they had their own cooperative organizations, and that made the liberal leaders, or the liberal strategists, class strategists, especially aggressive. And here you see a few of these. Cecil Rhodes at the bottom, the conquistador of the gold and diamonds of South Africa. You can really say of him that he caused the Boer War, an initially tragic and failing war against the Dutch settlers there, and of course always against the black original populations of Africa. And there his trusted confidant, Lord Milner. And Lord Milner led a group within the British ruling class which remained in power until roughly the 1930s, and they had detected this danger in Germany, not just a rising power, which strictly speaking could be met by economic competition, but they also detected this particularly strong socialist labor movement, which might turn that economic advance into something completely new in terms of social history, really like an evolutionary species boost, if you can put it in that way. And that is why some very interesting books have appeared recently about the origins of the First World War. I won't explain that in detail, but these books claim it was never Germany that was the threat, although that is the story that's most usually told to us. Of course, Kaiser Wilhelm II was a nutcase, But that didn't mean that he was the really aggressive force in the clash that led to the First World War. That was something that was organized out of the City of London by the Milner Group. And I can tell you, I found it very convincing what I heard there. Now we get to the last. I hope I didn't keep you too long. And that is what I think is happening today, and it may take 5 years, it may take 50 years. But the main issue that we see today is that it's not the BRICS versus the West, although of course we must recognize that, we must see the dynamics of that, we must see the population policies that are formulated from that angle. But what I think is happening is that the elites in the BRICS are eagerly looking to be included, as they were before, in the successors to the Milner Group. The Milner Group formed an Anglo-American group of ruling class figures who conferred every year and sometimes entirely through the year about what to do, what their strategy would be. And after the Second World War, of course, we got the Bilderberg conferences, the Trilateral Commission, the World Economic Forum that we read about or read about a few years ago every day. The ruling classes from the BRICS were initially included but were thrown out as part of the conflicts between the West and the BRICS. And what will happen is not a definitive and final fight between the BRICS and the West, but a struggle for democracy in which the populations of the world will fight their oligarchies, who for the moment, I must say, are considerably better organized, even in spite of the split along the BRICS G7 lines, than the world population, which of course as such doesn't exist in an organized form. It only exists in the form of national contingents. And that was really what I wanted to add to your excellent discussions that we have already had concerning the BRICS phenomenon. Thank you.